Modern countries weren't always as we know them today. In this video, let's journey through time to understand the key events and transformations that led to the formation of today's nations. There's been a lot of talk in the news about borders. The fact that some imaginary line drawn hundreds of years ago defines a major part of my identity and differentiates me from a person who lives on the other side of that line is kind of weird, right? I mean, being born in California makes me an American citizen, yet California is much closer geographically to Mexico than it is to, say, New York. Yet, I identify much more closely with a New Yorker than I do with a Mexican. This leads me to question, why do borders exist in the first place? As we move towards a globalized world, it may be beneficial to eliminate borders and divisiveness to focus on developing our world as a whole. However, this may involve fighting off aliens. Countries are not real entities, but rather imaginary ideas that most people agree on. They first existed due to human genetics, which evolved in small hunter-gatherer bands. While modern humans don't live in hunter-gatherer bands, they still identify with different groups to satisfy their need for belonging. In high school, you see this in the hierarchical division of students from nerds to jocks to the popular crowd. In adulthood, you see this in how many identify as particular sports fans, parts of a particular religion, avid consumers of particular brands, etc. As hunter-gatherer bands formed, competition intensified, and the need for group membership became more important for self-preservation. Hierarchy in groups allowed for efficiency, often involving a leader with significant resources or power. Human bands either worked together or fought each other, with those who worked together potentially forming coalitions to gain access to more resources. This led to a shift in human behavior towards cooperation and cooperation. Eventually, with the introduction of agriculture, hierarchy became more well-defined as some haves were able to collect, store, and gain control over the food supply and other valuable resources, allowing them to gain power over the have-nots. Over time, civilizations developed, along with the unique cultures, languages, food, etc., that come with them. But countries were yet to exist. Instead, there were empires, kingdoms, city-states, or tribal lands. There were no politically set boundaries outside of natural barriers that acted as borders. And if you look at ancient maps, the idea of having an arbitrary line to delineate one empire from another or one tribe from another was non-existent. Instead, it was implied and often fought over. So the question remains, how did the world end up how it is, where some kind of government accounts for every single piece of land, and the people that live within those imaginary lines consider themselves to be citizens of that government? Some call the transition to the modern country that we are all familiar with the rise of the nation-state. Before the nation-state, most people probably identified themselves with their region or local lord. Most did not leave their villages and knew little of the world at large. The birth of the First Nations. The concept of a nation-state did not emerge overnight, but rather through a gradual historical process. It is difficult to pinpoint a single First Nation, as the formation of countries occurred independently in various parts of the world. However, ancient civilizations provide early examples of organized states. Mesopotamia, situated between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, witnessed the rise of the Sumerian city-states around 3500 before the Common Era. These city-states, such as Ur and Uruk, exhibited characteristics of early nations, including centralized governance, legal systems, and distinct identities. Similarly, the ancient Egyptian civilization along the Nile River showcased many attributes of nationhood, with a central authority in the form of pharaohs, shared cultural practices, and a sense of Egyptian identity. So, around the middle of the last millennium, say around 1500, when economic, scientific, and philosophical change was rapidly occurring in Europe, many monarchs began to try to conquer and unify all the territories and people under their control to become more powerful. To encourage unity, many monarchs encouraged their subjects to feel loyal toward them, marking the first steps toward the idea of nationalism. One example is Russia. For most of the medieval period, Russia was simply a small kingdom located around the city of Moscow. Over hundreds of years, the rulers of Moscow took more and more land through both diplomacy and war, and eventually conquered much of what is now considered to be Russia. When Ivan the Terrible came of age, he was throned as the first Tsar of Russia. He destroyed the nobility and granted bureaucratic positions to successful traders of the commercial class. Similar occurrences happened all over Europe, in places like France and England. By the 19th century, most, if not all, of the Western world had been divided into new political units known as countries or nation-states. But what about the rest of the world? The rest of the world did not have the luck that the West did, where countries developed organically. From the age of exploration to the Industrial Revolution, the dominance of Europe's economy and military allowed it to colonize pretty much the entire world. Part of this meant dividing up the world into colonies agreed upon by European powers. At times, this meant drawing a simple, arbitrary straight line to make things easier. After the Second World War and the start of decolonization, the borders stayed put, grouping together people with different cultural, racial, and linguistic identities, while splitting apart others. This created a lot of chaos which, 70 years later, can still be felt. Many argue this is one of the main reasons why the Middle East and Africa are so messed up. However, borders may be an idea of the past as we move into the 21st century. Currently, in Europe, national borders have little meaning. It's similar to how the United States works. All citizens who belong to a country that is part of the European Union can travel, live, and work freely throughout. All internal tax and trade restrictions have been removed, and many identify no longer as a citizen of their country but as a citizen of the European Union. Many of us, however, refuse to even think about what citizenship and border lines actually mean. Instead of working on fostering friendship and partnership across borders, we subject ourselves to our most basic human emotions. These emotions may have allowed us to evolve into what we are today, but they may keep us from evolving into what we might be tomorrow. The evolution of nations is a story of change, conflict, and adaptation. Understanding how countries were formed gives us a deeper appreciation of the complex history behind modern national identities. Join us for more intriguing insights into the history of nations and their ongoing transformations. Thank you for listening to this episode of Culture Emissary. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the thumbs up button below and subscribe to stay updated with my most recent video.